Joining us now to analyze today's headlines is Robert Jensen. He's an author and a professor of journalism at the University of Texas at Austin. Hi, Bob. Well, Iran has been moving heavy weapons into Iraq for the fight against the Islamic State. A New York Times report has just revealed U.S. military intelligence officials speaking anonymously to the paper have detected the deployment of Iranian missiles and rockets in the battle for Tikrit in northern Iraq, and contend that Iraqi Shia militias fighting alongside Iraqi National Army troops are being armed directly by Iran. Despite the fears of Iran's growing influence in the region, high-level talks between the U.S. and Iran have resumed this morning in Switzerland. An ill-conceived letter sent by 47 GOP members to Iran's leadership seems to have done little damage, and negotiators are optimistic that they will meet a March 31st deadline to resolve Western concerns over Iran's nuclear development in exchange for an end to sanctions. Bob, how important is it for the West to make peace with Iran?
Well, this is a reality check. The United States has long operated in the world as if it doesn't have to acknowledge reality, but of course Iran is one of the dominant regional powers, and there is no progress in the Middle East on a number of issues without Iran. So whether you're looking at the Israel-Palestine conflict, Syria, Iraq, all of these things require a realistic engagement with Iran. It also means, of course, that challenging some of the U.S. other allies like Saudi Arabia. This is part of a regional problem. There are regional solutions, and all of them involved. The United States finally abandoned a psychotic rejection of Iran as a regional player.
And here in the United States, Missouri's oldest death row inmate is set to be executed today unless the U.S. Supreme Court intervenes or Governor Jay Nixon grants him clemency. Lawyers for Cecil Clayton, a 74-year-old white man, argued that their client suffers from dementia and hallucinations resulting from brain surgery for a 1972 sawmill accident. Doctors removed part of Clayton's frontal lobe before he fatally shot a sheriff's deputy 20 years ago. The state Supreme Court has refused to stay the execution and has repeatedly denied requests to review Clayton's mental competency. He is scheduled to die this evening at 7 p.m. by lethal injection and could become the 10th person to be killed by the state this year, by the U.S. in general this year. Now, Bob, if Missouri killed this man, it would not be the first time that a state has executed a mentally ill inmate, is it?
No, sadly, it's not. But the U.S. Supreme Court, the current court, not particularly known for its compassion, has been clear on this, that people without the capacity to understand their actions shouldn't be executed. That means people we've traditionally called mentally retarded or mentally ill. Yet the fact that the court has been clear on this has not always carried the day. In the Texas where I live, we currently have 2 executions. One is on hold from a circuit court of appeals judgment, but the other one is scheduled to go forward. In both cases, demonstrated mental illness, schizophrenia, other kinds of diagnoses that make it clear that if there is a definition of cruel and unusual punishment, it is executing people without the capacity in their acts. And right, the Supreme Court, we're not seeing that trickling.
And we will report on what happens to the case of Cecil Clayton tomorrow. And finally, the LA Times reported this morning that a major battle is heating up between the Obama administration and the food industry over the labeling of added sugar content. The Food and Drug Administration, or FDA, is considering a proposal to clearly label how much sugar or other sweeteners are added to a product, which the sugar industry is predictably up in arms over. In fact, Sugar Association President Andrew Briscoe wrote to the government, quote, "The lack of science to justify added sugar labeling sets an alarming precedent." Meanwhile, a number of dietitians and nutritionists were just found to be paid by Coca-Cola to suggest a can of Mini Coke as a healthy snack in online publications for American Heart Month. Bob, isn't the science of sugar being linked to obesity, diabetes, heart disease, etc., pretty well established?
Well established unless you work for the food industry, of course. You know, there are 2 interesting aspects to this. One is when the corporations want to reject any controls over advertising, they argue that information is good and advertising is just information, and more information is always better. Yet when the government tries to impose labeling requirements, which are, after all, a form of information, all of a sudden the corporations throw their arms up in alarm about how the government is somehow deceiving the public. knowing how much sugar is added to a food is important. The second thing I think is interesting is, why is all this sugar being added to processed food? It's because the food itself is so bad. It tells us something also about the nature of the food industry, that added sugar replaces what would be the taste that comes from good cooking. So I think we see both the hypocrisy of the corporations on advertising and the utterly ridiculous quality of our food at stake here.
Bob Jensen, it's always a pleasure to have you on. We'll talk to you again next week.
Thanks, Sonali.
Robert Jensen is our daily Newsflash guest expert. He's an author and a professor of journalism at the University of Texas at Austin. This is Uprising. We'll be right back.